I've never been much for celebrations. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, they all seem to slip by me in the blur of long work shifts and quiet evenings at home. But Father's Day was always different. Maybe because it was the one day of the year when the world paused, however briefly, to acknowledge the men who had carried heavy loads in silence. For years, I never expected much. A handmade card when my daughter was little. A tie she picked out when she was a teenager, the colors clashing terribly with every shirt I owned. Once she bought me a mug that read #1dad. I still keep it, chipped on the handle, tucked on the back shelf of my kitchen cabinet. Those things, small, imperfect, meant the world to me. But this year felt different before it even began. She had married into a wealthier family, and though I never said it aloud, I knew I had slowly become a supporting character in her life story. She lived across town now, in a house with 2 staircases and a backyard pool. Her husband's parents visited often, their luxury SUV parked right out front like a declaration. I, meanwhile, came by bus most of the time. Still, when she called and said, "Dad, we're doing a Father's Day dinner. Please come. It wouldn't be complete without you," my heart swelled. I told myself it meant she hadn't forgotten who I was, where I stood in her life. I pressed my only good shirt, polished the scuffed brown shoes I'd worn to weddings and funerals, and took 2 buses across town that Sunday afternoon. The moment I stepped into her house, laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread lingered, warm and inviting. Her husband, polished, confident, always with a half smile that felt rehearsed, patted me on the back and said, "Glad you made it, sir." Sir, not Dad, not even by my name, sir. I found my seat at the long dining table covered with a linen cloth, candles lit even though it was barely dusk. My daughter was radiant, bustling around, making sure everyone had a glass of wine, adjusting the plates like a hostess from a glossy magazine spread. Across from me sat her father-in-law, a large man with a voice that filled the room, a man whose opinion everyone seemed to pause for. His laugh was rich, the kind that made others laugh even if they didn't catch the joke. I tried not to measure myself against him, but it was hard. He wore a pressed white shirt with cufflinks. I wore the shirt I'd ironed twice to hide the fraying at the collar. Dinner passed in polite chatter. They spoke about vacations, investments, their favorite new restaurants. I listened quietly, my fork moving slowly, the roasted chicken tender but somehow hard to swallow. Then, after dessert was cleared, my daughter stood up with a sparkle in her eyes. "Now," she announced, her voice bright, "since it's Father's Day, we have something special for the fathers in the room." My heart tightened. The fathers, that meant him and me. She turned to her father-in-law first. With a dramatic gesture, she pulled out an envelope sealed with a gold sticker. He opened it slowly, eyes widening as he read. "A cruise," he said, laughter booming. "A 7-day Caribbean cruise." The table erupted in applause. My daughter clapped her hands, her husband kissed her cheek. Everyone congratulated the man for simply existing long enough to be rewarded with luxury. He stood and hugged her, telling her she was too generous, too thoughtful. I smiled faintly, waiting. My chest was tight, but I told myself, don't compare. She'll have something small for you, something just as meaningful in her way. She turned then, almost as an afterthought, and placed a little white envelope in my hand. "And for you, Dad," she said, her tone lighter, teasing. I opened it. Inside was a single lottery ticket. The table went silent for a moment. Then her husband chuckled. Then the others followed. Soon the room roared with laughter. "Hey, you never know," someone joked. "Imagine if that's the winning ticket." Another chimed in. Even her father-in-law, still holding his luxury cruise certificate, chuckled and said, "Well, maybe you'll get lucky, old man." I forced a smile, my fingers folding the thin paper over and over, trying to keep them from shaking. I laughed lightly because what else could I do? But inside, something cracked. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was the comparison, the message. That to one man she gave the world, and to me she gave a joke, a punchline for the evening's entertainment. I caught her eyes for a fleeting second. She wasn't cruel, not deliberately, but there was something careless in the way she looked at me, like she had long stopped thinking of me as someone who needed honoring, like she thought I'd be content with scraps of humor. The laughter faded. The conversations moved on, but I barely heard them. The lottery ticket sat in my pocket, light as air yet heavy as stone. I looked around the table at faces shining in candlelight. They all seemed so sure of themselves, so comfortable in their little circle of success. And me, I was the outsider in a celebration that was supposed to belong to me as much as anyone else. That night, as I sat quietly in the back of the bus home, I pulled the ticket from my pocket again. The edges were already soft from being folded and unfolded. I stared at the numbers, tiny black digits printed on cheap paper. Everyone had laughed at it, but a thought whispered in me, stubborn as an ember in ash. What if? I didn't know it yet, but that question would change everything. The sound of laughter has a strange way of lingering. Even after the room goes quiet, it hangs in the air, echoing in your chest long after it should have died out. That night it clung to me like smoke on old clothes. They laughed at me. Not cruelly, perhaps. Not with fangs bared or voices sharpened into insults. But laughter doesn't always need to be sharp to cut deep. Sometimes it's the kind that slides under your skin like a thin blade, small, almost invisible, but it keeps twisting the more you think about it. At that table, their faces lit by soft candlelight, I saw mouths open wide, shoulders shaking, tears forming at the corners of eyes. They laughed as if the whole evening had been building up to that moment, as if I had unknowingly been cast as the punchline of their little play. I kept my smile steady. Years of practice had taught me how. When you work in factories, when your body aches but you still have to show up for double shifts, when your wife leaves and you swallow the questions instead of shouting them, you learn the art of pretending you're fine. That night was just another performance. Inside, though, I was shrinking. Each chuckle, each playful jab about my lucky numbers, chipped away at the fragile armor I'd worn to the dinner. "Careful, Dad," my daughter's husband said between bites of cake. "If you win, you'll have to learn how to manage wealth. Can't just put it under the mattress." The table erupted again. I stirred my coffee slowly, focusing on the swirl of cream instead of the red on my face. I wanted to disappear into that porcelain cup, to vanish before anyone could notice how the joke wasn't bouncing off me, it was sinking in. Her father-in-law raised his glass, his voice booming. "Here's to luck. May the ticket bring you all the fortune you deserve." There was something about the way he said it, mocking, yet coated in false generosity, that burned more than anything. I clinked my glass against his, my hand trembling, hoping no one noticed. In those moments, I thought back to other rooms, other tables. The factory break room, where younger men would laugh at my slow knees. The parent-teacher nights, where other fathers arrived in pressed suits while I came straight from work in grease-stained jeans. The living room when my wife packed her bags, muttering about wanting more, while my daughter sat silent on the couch, not meeting my eyes. Laughter had always followed me, not the joyful kind, but the kind that reminded me I was less educated, less polished, less worthy. That night as they carried on, I excused myself quietly. I stepped into the kitchen saying I needed some water. The sink glistened under recessed lights, a spotless island of chrome. I turned the faucet on, letting the cool stream run over my fingers. I stared at my reflection in the darkened window. The face staring back at me was older than the one I carried in my head, lined, weary, a man who looked like he had been holding something heavy for too long. "Smile," I whispered to myself, because I knew when I returned to the table the play would continue. I had my role, the grateful father, the good sport. No one wanted the truth bleeding onto the tablecloth. When I walked back in, they hardly noticed I'd left. They were too busy planning Crew's outfits, joking about sunscreen and seasickness. My daughter was glowing, proud of the gift she'd given. When she caught my eye, she smiled as if expecting me to be happy for them. I forced the corners of my lips upward, nodding, because what else could I do? But deep inside, something stirred, not anger, not yet. More like a quiet seed planting itself in soil it hadn't found before. A thought, is this how they'll always see me? A relic, a shadow, a joke. Dinner ended with hugs and photographs. My daughter wrapped her arms around me, kissed my cheek. "Thanks for coming, Dad. It means a lot." Her perfume lingered after she pulled away, sweet but sharp. I held her a little longer than she expected, not because I wanted to embarrass her, but because I remembered the little girl who once clung to me in grocery store aisles, who once said I was her hero. Somewhere along the years, that little girl had slipped away, replaced by this grown woman who thought a lottery ticket was a suitable gift for the man who had raised her. On the bus ride home, the laughter replayed in my head like a cruel recording. The faces blurred into one, all grinning, all shaking with amusement at my expense. I pressed the ticket between my palms, the paper thin but unyielding. I almost tore it in half, just to rid myself of the reminder. But something, call it pride, call it stubbornness, kept me from doing it. I slipped it back into my pocket, clenched my fist, and whispered into the empty bus, "We'll see." That night, I lay awake in my small apartment, the city humming faintly outside my window. My daughter's laughter kept breaking through the silence, cutting deeper than I cared to admit. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, the ticket resting on the nightstand beside me. A joke, they'd called it. A punchline. But sometimes jokes carry more weight than the one who told them will ever know. The ticket sat on my nightstand for 2 days, staring at me like a silent dare. Every time I looked at it, I heard their laughter again, the kind that scraped against bone. I almost threw it out more than once. A single piece of paper, cheap ink, nothing but a reminder that to them I was less. But something inside me refused to let it go. Maybe it was pride, maybe spite, maybe I just didn't want to play the role they'd written for me. The fool who took his joke gift and tossed it away without a second glance. So on the third evening, after a long day that had drained me more than I cared to admit, I sat down at the kitchen table. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that can feel heavy, pressing in from the walls. A single bulb above the table flickered, buzzing faintly, casting everything in a tired yellow glow. I laid the ticket in front of me, smoothing it with my calloused hands. The edges were already worn from being folded and unfolded. Next to it I set a coin, an old silver quarter I'd carried for years, worn smooth in places from time. I held the coin for a moment, staring at the ticket. The numbers blurred, then sharpened again as my breath fogged the thin paper. "Let's see what kind of joke you really are," I muttered and pressed the coin to the first little gray square. Scratch! The silver film curled up, dust falling onto the table like ashes. A number appeared. I compared it to the printed row of winning numbers. It matched. I blinked, leaning closer. One number down. I told myself not to read into it. One number meant nothing. I moved to the next square. The coin hissed softly as it scraped. Another number appeared, another match. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "No way," I whispered. Third square, my hand trembled now. But the coin kept moving. The gray film peeled back. Another match. By then my heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. I pushed the chair back and stood, pacing the small kitchen, running my hands over my face. "Calm down. These things don't happen to people like you." But something pulled me back to the table. The ticket waited, half-scratched, as if daring me to finish. I sat again, gripping the coin so tightly it left an imprint in my fingers. Fourth square, match. Fifth square, match. I froze. My breath came in shallow gasps. Sweat prickled at the back of my neck. There were still 2 more to go. If they matched, I scratched the 6th. The number shone through, match. "God Almighty," I said aloud, my voice cracking. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the coin. The last square blurred before my eyes as tears welled up. My entire body leaned over the table as though sheer will could make it turn out right. I pressed down and scraped, slowly, carefully. The number appeared. It matched. For a long moment I just sat there, staring at the row of numbers. All 7 lined up perfectly. My mind couldn't wrap around it. I grabbed the ticket with both hands, flipping it back and forth, scanning for fine print. My eyes caught the bold words at the top. "Grand jackpot $120,000,000." The room tilted. I thought for a second I might fall out of the chair. My chest heaved and a sound escaped my throat, not quite laughter, not quite sobbing, something raw and unfamiliar. I pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. My knees nearly buckled. I staggered to the sink, splashing cold water on my face, gripping the counter as if it could hold me steady. "Is this real?" I whispered to the empty room. "Is this really happening?" The hum of the refrigerator answered, the flicker of the light above, the quiet world of my apartment unchanged. And yet everything was different. I sat again, holding the ticket like it was a fragile relic. My hands kept shaking. I thought of calling someone, anyone, but who? My daughter. No, I could still hear her laughter echoing in my head. My ex-wife, she would think I was lying. For years I had lived in the shadow of not enough. Not enough money, not enough status, not enough to be taken seriously. And now, on a whim, on a joke, they had handed me the kind of power most men never even dream of. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Almost. I stared at the numbers again, memorizing them, terrified that if I blinked they would rearrange themselves and vanish. But they didn't. They stayed. The thought crept in slowly, quietly, and then settled like a weight in my chest. They laughed at me for holding this ticket. They laughed because they thought it meant nothing. But this little joke, it just changed everything. I leaned back in the chair, the edges of my mouth twitching. Not quite a smile, not yet, but something close. Outside, the city lights flickered. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But inside that small kitchen, in the quiet of my old apartment, a man who had been overlooked, forgotten, dismissed, held in his hands a future no one could have imagined. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the spark of something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. News travels fast in a family, even when you try to keep it quiet. Maybe I should have waited, held it close to my chest a little longer, savored the secret like a fine drink. But the truth is, something inside me needed them to know. Needed them to hear it from my lips, to see it in my hands. So when my daughter called 2 days later, inviting me over again, "Dad, we've got leftovers from the dinner, come by for lunch," I said yes. I took the same bus route, though this time the ride felt different. I carried the ticket in my inside jacket pocket, tucked into an envelope like a fragile heartbeat. My fingers kept brushing against it, checking every few minutes that it was still there, as if it might vanish if I didn't hold on. When I arrived, the house was the same as before, polished, bright, a smell of citrus candles drifting through the open door. My daughter greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, her eyes distracted. She looked tired, though she tried to mask it with her hostess smile. We sat at the same dining table, though this time without the candles and finery. Plates of reheated chicken and pasta filled the space between us. Her husband chatted about work, her father-in-law bragged about preparing for the cruise, and I sat quietly watching. They hadn't changed since that night. Why would they? To them, I was still the man with the funny gift, the butt of the joke. Halfway through the meal, her husband leaned back and smirked. "Hey Dad, did you scratch that ticket yet? Any yachts in your future?" The table chuckled. Something inside me steadied then. My hands stopped trembling. My voice found a calm I hadn't felt in years. "Yes," I said simply. They paused, forks suspended midair. "And," he prodded, his grin widening. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the envelope and laid it flat on the table. Slowly, carefully, I slid the ticket out and placed it on the linen cloth. My daughter frowned. "Dad." "I scratched it," I said, my voice steady. Every number matched, all of them. For a moment, silence. The kind of silence that drops like a heavy curtain, muffling every sound in the room. Her husband laughed first, too loud, too forced. "Come on, really, you're kidding." I didn't answer. I simply slid the ticket toward him. He picked it up, eyes scanning the numbers. The grin faltered. His brows furrowed. He pulled his phone from his pocket, typing rapidly, checking the winning numbers online. The color drained from his face. He handed the ticket to his father, who put on his reading glasses, muttering under his breath. A moment later, he looked up at me, his mouth slightly open but no sound coming out. My daughter snatched the ticket next, her hands shaking. She compared it line by line, her lips moving silently. Then she looked at me, eyes wide, as if seeing me for the first time. It's real," she whispered. $120 million. I said, not loud, not triumphant. Just a fact plain as the fork beside my plate. No one laughed. The room was still save for the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear someone's breathing quicken, maybe my daughter's, maybe my own. Her father-in-law cleared his throat. "Well, that's extraordinary," he said, his voice thinner than usual. Her husband leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, eyes darting like a man who just realized the ground beneath him had shifted. And my daughter, my sweet little girl who once made me cards out of construction paper and glitter, she just stared, her lips trembling. I looked at each of them in turn, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the smallest man in the room. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the joke. The silence stretched on, heavy, awkward, almost suffocating. They didn't know what to say, how to fill it. Finally, I leaned back, folded my arms, and said softly, "Funny, isn't it? How a little piece of paper can change everything." No one laughed, and in that silence I felt a shift, not just in the room, but in me. When the laughter died in that dining room, something else took its place. Silence, heavy and uneasy. But silence doesn't erase memory. If anything, it stirs it up. On the ride home that night, as the city lights flickered past the bus windows, the ghosts of my past came crowding back. I closed my eyes and saw my hands, younger then, raw and blistered from factory work. I was barely 20 when I started at the steel plant, the machines roaring like beasts around me. The air smelled of sweat and hot iron, and by the time my shift ended each night, my body felt as though it had been beaten with invisible fists. But I kept going, because I had a wife who depended on me, and soon after, a baby girl who clung to my finger with her tiny hand as if I were her whole world. I can still see her first steps in the living room. The carpet was worn, the wallpaper peeling, but in that moment it felt like a palace. She wobbled toward me, arms outstretched, and when she fell into my chest, her giggles were sweeter than any music. I promised myself I would always catch her, and for years I did. Every school play, every scraped knee, every bedtime story when I could barely keep my eyes open after the night shift, I showed up. I wasn't the smartest, I wasn't the richest, but I was there. Her mother, my wife, saw things differently. "We can't live like this forever," she used to say, her voice sharp with disappointment. She wanted more, fancier clothes, a bigger house, vacations that cost more than my yearly wages. When I told her I was doing my best, she shook her head like my best was never enough. In the end, she left, packed her bags one evening while our daughter sat silent on the couch, clutching her schoolbook. I remember kneeling down, telling my little girl it wasn't her fault, even though a part of me wondered if it was mine, if my calloused hands and tired eyes had made me too small in her mother's world. From then on, it was just the two of us. I worked harder, took every overtime shift I could, walked home when I couldn't afford bus fare. There were nights I came home so sore I could barely climb the stairs. But when I saw her sleeping, her face calm, I knew it was worth it. I remember once she begged me for ballet lessons. We didn't have the money. Rent was due, bills stacked high, but I found a way. I sold my old tools, skipped meals, and paid for the classes. The look on her face when she tried on her first pair of pink slippers, it lit up the whole apartment. She didn't know the cost. She didn't see me sitting in the dark kitchen, eating bread crusts because I couldn't afford dinner that week. But that's what fathers do. We carry the weight quietly. And yet, somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing it. Maybe it was when she went off to college, surrounded by classmates whose fathers drove shiny cars and wore expensive watches. Maybe it was when she married into a family that measured worth in dollars and destinations. I don't know when exactly I became invisible to her, but I felt it long before the lottery ticket. In the way she introduced me to her friends, quick, casual, as if I were an uncle rather than the man who raised her. In the way she rarely asked about my life, my health, my days. The lottery ticket was just the cruelest version of a truth I had been living with for years, that in her eyes, I wasn't enough. On the bus that night, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. The city blurred past, neon signs, shadowed alleys, the glow of corner stores, and I thought about the strange weight of love, how it can make a man endure anything, how it can also break him. I loved her so much that even her neglect cut deeper than any blade. I loved her so much that even now, with $120 million waiting in my pocket, I would have traded it all for one look from her, the look she used to give me when she was little, when I was her hero. But heroes grow old. Heroes become ordinary men, and ordinary men get laughed at for holding lottery tickets. As I sat there, the ticket pressed to my chest inside my jacket, I realized something. Money could fill my fridge, pay my bills, even buy me a house with more than one staircase. But it couldn't rewind the years. It couldn't take me back to the nights when my daughter curled against me on the couch, watching cartoons, whispering that she never wanted to let me go. The ghosts of yesterday walked with me as I stepped off the bus. They followed me up the stairs of my apartment building, their voices whispering all the times I had been less, all the times I had been invisible. And as I unlocked my door, one thought lodged itself deep in my chest. Winning the lottery didn't erase who I had been. It only put a spotlight on what they never saw in me to begin with. The first call came the morning after the numbers were announced on the evening news. I hadn't told a soul outside that dining room, but secrets like that don't stay secrets for long. Maybe my daughter told someone. Maybe her husband bragged at work. Or maybe news like this has a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly you try to hold it. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, pulling me out of a restless sleep. I reached for it, my body still stiff, and pressed it to my ear. "Congratulations." A voice boomed. I had to pull the phone back to recognize it. It was an old coworker from the plant, a man I hadn't heard from in over a decade. "Harry," I said slowly. "Yeah, it's me. I saw the news, couldn't believe it. You of all people, man, the luck. Listen, I always knew you deserved better. Always said so, didn't I?" I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Harry was the same man who used to laugh at the way I brought leftovers in Tupperware while others went out for steak sandwiches. The same man who once told me I was married to the machines and would die there. Now he was telling me he always believed in me. Before I could answer, he laughed. "We should catch up sometime, huh? Maybe you can show me the ropes of this new life. Hell, maybe we could even go into business together. What do you say?" I mumbled something polite and hung up, but the phone didn't stop. By noon, it had rung 23 times. Cousins I hadn't seen since my wedding, neighbors from 2 apartments ago, even a preacher I'd met once at a funeral. They all had the same tone, bright, congratulatory, dripping with enthusiasm. But under the words I heard it, hunger. "God must have chosen you," one cousin said. "And maybe he chose you to help the family too." Another, "We should meet for dinner, my treat." "Well, maybe your treat now." Followed by a nervous laugh. Even my ex-wife called. Her voice was softer than I remembered, almost sweet. "I'm happy for you," she said. "You've always worked so hard. Maybe this is your chance to finally live." Then, after a pause, "You know, our daughter could use some help with the mortgage. And my medical bills have been piling up." I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the peeling paint on my wall. A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Years of silence, of being overlooked, forgotten. And now, suddenly, I was the most popular man in town. By the end of the week, I stopped answering. The voicemail filled up with voices that blurred together. Too many, so proud of you, S. Too many, just thought I'd check in, S. But the calls did something to me. They opened my eyes, because as I listened, I realized not one of them asked about me. Not really. They didn't ask how I was handling the shock, whether I was eating, whether I needed company in the lonely hours of the night. They only asked about the money, sometimes directly, sometimes with the kind of sly dancing words that circle the truth but never touch it. I thought about the times I'd been sick, the winters when my heat barely worked, the birthdays that passed unnoticed. None of those voices had called then. It made me wonder, was this what my life had amounted to? That my worth in their eyes could be measured by numbers printed on a ticket? One night, unable to sleep, I turned the ringer off and just sat there, staring at the silent phone. The ghosts of my past, from the factory, from my broken marriage, from lonely holidays, they had all returned, wearing new masks, disguising their intentions with sugar-coated words. but underneath I saw them clearly. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt watched, studied, like prey circled by hunters pretending to clap. I thought back to that dining table on Father's Day, the laughter, the cruise package, the ticket handed like a joke. Back then, they thought I was the smallest man in the room. Now, suddenly, I was the richest. But the truth, the hard truth, was that in both rooms they hadn't seen me, only what I could or couldn't give. And that realization hurt more than all the laughter combined. It was a Thursday evening when I heard the knock on my door. Not the hurried rap of a delivery man, not the dull thud of a neighbor checking in, but a hesitant rhythm, soft, uncertain. I opened the door and there she was, my daughter. My little girl, though she was 35 now, with lines of exhaustion etched faintly around her eyes. Her makeup was smudged, her hair pinned back in haste, and in her hand she twisted a tissue already damp with tears. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. For a moment I couldn't speak. Memories washed over me, her first bicycle ride, her high school graduation, the way she used to cling to my hand when crossing the street. But those memories collided with others, her laughter at the dinner table, the lottery ticket treated like a joke. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside silently. She walked in, her perfume trailing faintly behind, though dulled by the scent of her tears. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd scratched the ticket, her hands folded tight as if in prayer. "I'm so sorry," she said finally. I lowered myself into the chair opposite, studying her face. She looked smaller than usual, fragile in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Sorry for what?" I asked softly, though the answer sat heavy between us. She bit her lip. For that night, for the gift, for everything. I waited. Her eyes filled again, tears spilling unchecked. "Dad, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I swear I wasn't. The ticket, it was supposed to be fun, a little joke. I thought you'd laugh." "Laugh," I repeated, the word sharp in my mouth. She nodded quickly, desperate. "Yes, I wasn't thinking about how it would look, about how it would feel. I don't know, Dad. I made a mistake, a stupid mistake." The room was quiet except for her sniffles. I leaned back, folding my arms. "Do you know what it felt like?" I asked. My voice was calm, but my heart beat like a drum. To sit there surrounded by people who barely know me and be handed a joke when another man was handed a gift worth thousands. "Do you know what it felt like to have your laughter, my own daughter's laughter, join theirs?" Her face crumpled. "Dad, please, I didn't mean." "But you did," I said gently, cutting her off. "Maybe not out of malice, maybe out of carelessness. But that's almost worse, isn't it? That you didn't even think about me enough to realize what you were doing." She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. For a moment I wanted to reach out, to hold her the way I once did when nightmares woke her at night, but I kept still. "I love you," she sobbed. "I always have. I got caught up with my life, with them. Sometimes I forget what matters, but you matter, Dad, you always have." Her words hung in the air, fragile as glass, and there I was, caught between two truths. One, that she was my daughter, the child I had sacrificed for, the little girl who once thought I hung the moon. Two, that she had wounded me deeply, thoughtlessly, in a way that revealed how far apart we had drifted. I wanted to believe her tears. I wanted to take them as proof that somewhere under the layers of her new life, her heart still carried me. But another voice whispered, "Or are these tears for the money? For the chance slipping through her fingers if she doesn't mend this bridge?" I studied her, and for the first time I saw both. The child she was and the woman she had become, layered on top of each other like double exposure in an old photograph. Finally, I spoke. "Do you know what hurts more than the joke? It's realizing that you thought so little of me. That in that moment you didn't see your father, the man who carried you, fed you, worked his hands raw for you. You saw something less." Her sobs quieted into hiccups. She lowered her hands, her eyes red and swollen. "I see you now," she whispered. I don't know if it was the truth or just something she thought I needed to hear, but for the first time that night I let my hand rest lightly over hers. Her skin was warm, trembling. We sat like that for a while, father and daughter, two lives bound together by blood and history, tangled now by mistakes and regrets. When she left, she hugged me tightly, almost desperately. "I'll do better, Dad," she said against my shoulder. "I promise." I nodded, though my heart remained divided. After the door closed and her footsteps faded, I sat alone at the table, staring at the silent apartment. Her tears still echoed in my ears, but so did her laughter from that night. And I realized forgiveness is never as simple as words. It's not a switch you flip. It's a long road, and I was only just taking the first step. I've always believed money doesn't change people. It just unmasks them. What's hidden in the corners of their hearts crawls out when there's something to gain. I saw it most clearly in my daughter's father-in-law. The last time we'd sat at the table together, he was the star. He unwrapped his cruise package like a king receiving tribute, laughing loud enough to rattle the windows. His hand clamped my shoulder that night in a way that told me he saw himself above me, a man with comfort, leisure, and status, patting the laborer who would never rise higher. Now things had shifted. It started small. A phone call, polite, with more courtesy in 3 minutes than I'd ever heard from him in 3 years. "Just checking in," he said. "You must be busy with all the excitement. Thought maybe you'd like to have lunch sometime, my treat." I almost laughed at the "my treat." He hadn't offered me so much as a glass of wine at that Father's Day dinner, yet here he was, inviting me out. I agreed out of curiosity more than desire. We met at a downtown steakhouse, the kind with dim lights and leather booths. He was already seated when I arrived, a glass of expensive red wine swirling in his hand. He stood as I approached, clasping both my hands in his. "There he is," he boomed, "the man of the hour." I slid into the booth across from him, watching as he leaned forward, his smile wide, his eyes calculating. "You know," he said, "I always knew you had something in you. Life has a funny way of rewarding the right people, doesn't it?" I thought back to that cruise envelope in his hands, his smug grin, his careless laughter when I held the lottery ticket. If that was what he called knowing, then the man had a short memory. He ordered for both of us without asking, 2 prime rib steaks, medium rare, with sides that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. When the plates arrived, he launched into stories of his travels, his investments, his philosophy on money. "You have to be smart," he said, tapping the table for emphasis. "Money attracts all kinds of people. You need someone experienced, someone who knows the ropes to help you manage it. Lucky for you, that's exactly what I do. Real estate, stocks, overseas ventures, you name it, I've handled it." I cut into my steak slowly, chewing in silence, letting him talk. It was almost amusing, the way he circled around his point like a shark around bait. Finally, he leaned back, lowered his voice, and said, "Listen, we're family now, and family helps each other. If you'd like, I can take some of that weight off your shoulders, guide you, protect you from mistakes. You don't want to be one of those stories, lottery winners who lose it all in a few years. With me by your side, you won't." His eyes gleamed as he said it. The mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw not generosity but hunger. I set my fork down, wiped my mouth with the napkin, and looked him square in the eye. "Funny," I said quietly. "Just a week ago you laughed at me, laughed at the gift I was given as though I were the punchline of the evening." His smile faltered just for a second. "Oh, come now, don't take it that way. We were all having fun, just a bit of family humor." "Family humor," I repeated. He leaned forward again, his tone softer, his smile back in place. "Don't dwell on the past. We're in a new chapter now, and I think together we can make it a very successful one." I let his words hang between us. He didn't know it, but his eagerness only hardened something in me. Because here's what I realized. I could survive 1,000 careless laughs from strangers. But the moment people start smiling at me with masks on, the moment they start seeing my bank account instead of my face, that's when I know who they really are. We finished the meal, his stories flowing like wine, my responses few and measured. When the check came, he snatched it up before I could move, waving his hand dramatically. "This one's on me," he said, as if it were a gift I should treasure. As I left the steakhouse, the cool evening air hit me like a cleansing wave. I reached into my pocket and touched the envelope that still held the ticket, now safe in a bank deposit box but always near in my mind. And I thought, they don't see me. They see numbers. They see opportunity. They see a chance to climb higher on my back. Masks, all of them. Masks that only the shine of money had forced them to wear openly. And for the first time in a long time, I felt strangely calm, because I could finally see them for who they really were. There's a park not far from my apartment, the kind that doesn't make it onto postcards. The grass is patchy, the swings creak, and the benches have been carved with initials of kids who once swore their love would last forever. But it's quiet. That's what I need these days. Quiet. I've been coming here often since the ticket changed everything. I sit on the same wooden bench near the duck pond, watching the water ripple whenever the wind picks up. Children chase each other across the playground, their laughter rising like bubbles in the air. Mothers call out warnings, fathers push strollers, and the world keeps spinning as if nothing has happened. And maybe, to the world, nothing has. The headlines will forget me soon. The neighbors will stop whispering eventually. But inside me, everything has shifted. I leaned back on the bench, my jacket collar turned up against the autumn chill, and let my thoughts wander. Money. $120 million. It sounds absurd every time I say it in my head, like a number too big to belong to me. For so long, my life had been measured in small increments, paychecks that barely stretched, hours of overtime, bus fares counted down to the last dime. Now, suddenly, I could buy houses, cars, vacations, things I'd never even dreamed of. But as I watched a boy toss bread crumbs to the ducks, his father kneeling beside him, clapping proudly at every throw, a question gnawed at me. What does money actually change? It can pay bills, yes. It can fill a fridge, fix a roof, put heat in a home. I know the relief of not having to count every penny. I feel it every time I open my wallet now. But can it buy back years? Can it erase the look of disappointment in a daughter's eyes? Can it undo the nights I spent alone, wondering where I went wrong? The answer is no. I thought of my daughter, her tears at my kitchen table, her apologies tangled with excuses. If I handed her a new house tomorrow, would that heal the crack between us? Or would it just plaster over the wound, leaving it festering beneath? Across the pond, an old man shuffled by with a cane, his wife steadying him with one arm. Their steps were slow, uneven, but together they moved as one. I watched them and felt a pang. Money could buy them a better cane, a warmer coat, but it couldn't buy that steadying arm, the bond built over decades. I rubbed my hands together, rough still despite everything, and whispered to myself, so what is it for then? Maybe it wasn't for comfort. Maybe it wasn't even for me. Maybe the gift, if you could call it that, was meant to shine a light on the world around me, to test the people I loved, to peel back the masks. Because since that ticket was scratched, I've seen more truth than in the 65 years before it. I've seen hunger behind smiles, greed behind congratulations, fear behind apologies. And I've seen my own reflection more clearly. Too, the man who thought he was invisible, suddenly visible only because of numbers on a page. A little girl ran past my bench then, clutching a balloon, her father trailing behind, out of breath but laughing. She tripped, nearly fell, but he caught her by the arm just in time. She turned, beaming at him with the kind of pure adoration I remembered so well. I closed my eyes. For a second, I could almost feel my daughter's small hand in mine again, sticky from ice cream, trusting completely. Those were the riches of my life long before this ticket. And maybe that's the cruelest joke of all, that the world only sees my worth now when I'm rich in dollars, not when I was rich in love. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of church bells from a distance. I pulled my jacket tighter and stood slowly, my knees aching the way they always had. I walked out of the park with one thought pressing heavy in my chest. Money can open doors, but it cannot make someone step through them with love. They say revenge is best served cold, but I've lived long enough to know coldness only breeds more coldness. What I wanted wasn't fire or ice, it was clarity. For weeks after the ticket, I carried the weight of choices heavier than any steel I'd lifted in the plant. Everyone had their ideas for me: houses, cars, investments, vacations. My daughter's father-in-law whispered about partnerships. My ex-wife hinted at old debts. Cousins I barely remembered spoke of family obligations. But in the quiet of that park bench, watching children laugh and old couples walk hand in hand, I realized something. If I let this money make me bitter, then I'd be letting their laughter win twice. So I decided on a different path. A strange kind of revenge. Not with anger, not with cruelty, with kindness. The first step was small. I went to the local elementary school, the same one my daughter once attended, and asked about their lunch program. The principal, a weary woman with kind eyes, told me too many kids came to school hungry, their parents stretched thin. The next week I wrote a check that would cover hot meals for every child for the next 5 years. When the news broke, people asked me why. I shrugged. Because I know what it feels like to work hard and still not have enough. Next, I visited the nursing home a few blocks from my apartment. The building smelled of bleach and loneliness. I saw men there who looked like me, hands worn, backs bent, eyes dulled by abandonment. Some had children who never visited. Some had no one at all. I sat with them, listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes. Then I funded a renovation, new beds, better food, music in the halls, a garden where they could sit in the sun. Reporters came, snapping pictures, shoving microphones. Why here? They asked. Because one day I said, we all grow old and no father should be left feeling forgotten. I could see it in their faces, the surprise, the confusion. They expected a man who'd buy a mansion, not a man who'd spend millions on strangers. But strangers, I realized, were often the ones who understood me better than family ever had. Word spread quickly. Letters poured into my mailbox. Thank yous scrawled in crayon from children. Notes of gratitude from nurses. Even strangers who wrote simply to say, "You reminded me there are still good men left." And my family, they watched. My daughter's father-in-law, once so smug, now sat silent in gatherings, his plans to guide me unraveling with each headline. My daughter came by often, not with jokes or excuses, but with quiet eyes that followed me as if trying to relearn who I was. One evening she asked, "Dad, why not keep it for yourself? Don't you want more?" I thought about it, then smiled faintly. I've spent a lifetime with less. More doesn't change who I am, but maybe, just maybe, it can change how others are treated. She didn't answer right away, but I saw something shift in her, a light dawning where before there had been shadows. That, I think, was my true revenge. Not to throw my wealth in their faces, not to prove them wrong with yachts or penthouses, but to stand as living proof that dignity cannot be measured by price tags. Because the truth is, money doesn't make a man. His choices do, and I wanted my choices to echo louder than their laughter ever did. I never forgot that night at the table, the sound of them mocking me as I held the flimsy slip of paper. But now, when I remember it, I don't feel the sting as sharply, because I know what followed, that the very thing they dismissed became the tool that lifted others. And that, in its own quiet way, was sweeter than any cruise or luxury gift. My revenge was not to show them their cruelty. It was to show them their smallness in the face of kindness. There are nights when I sit by my window, the city humming faintly outside, and I think back on all the years that shaped me. Not the years of plenty, because there were none. Not the years of glory, because I was never a man of medals or recognition. No, what I remember most are the years of carrying weight. The long shifts at the plant, the sting of steel dust in my eyes, the ache in my shoulders that no medicine could dull. The nights I fell asleep on the couch with my boots still on because I was too tired to climb into bed. The mornings I packed my daughter's lunch before the sun rose, tucking in a note that said, "I love you. Do your best today." Back then, no one clapped for me. No cameras, no headlines, just a man and his duty. Sometimes I think the world forgets that the greatest work often goes unseen. You can't put it on a resume, you can't hang it on a wall, but it lives in the spaces between, the smile of a child who feels safe, the roof that doesn't leak because you patched it at midnight, the meal on the table even when your stomach growls empty. When the lottery came, it was like a mirror shoved in my face. Suddenly people looked at me, saw me, valued me, but not for who I was, for what I held. for the numbers that could buy comfort. And yet, in the quiet of my own heart, I know the truth. My worth was never written on that ticket. It was written in calluses on my hands, in the lines on my face carved by years of worry and love, in the memories of a little girl who once believed her father was the strongest man alive. I remember a winter when the pipes froze in our old apartment. My daughter cried because her breath puffed like smoke indoors. I held her close under every blanket we owned, whispering stories until she fell asleep, her small body trembling against mine. That night the heat didn't come from radiators, it came from love. No lottery can outshine that. I think of all the men like me, fathers who worked themselves thin, who went unnoticed, who were measured by their wallets instead of their hearts. I think of how many must have died believing they weren't enough, simply because the world told them so. But I know better now. The money lets me build schools, feed children, bring music to nursing homes. That's good. That matters. But even if it all disappeared tomorrow, even if the ticket had turned to ash the moment I scratched it, I would still be that man. The man who showed up. The man who loved. The man who, in his own quiet way, gave everything he had to someone else. A father's worth isn't counted in dollars. It isn't measured in vacations or fancy dinners. It's found in the small, stubborn acts of love that stack up over a lifetime until they form a foundation so solid it holds up generations. And if my daughter, if my family, if the world finally sees that now, it isn't because of a ticket. It's because of the truth that was always there, waiting for them to notice. So I sit by the window, listening to the hum of the city, and I feel something I haven't felt in a long time: peace. Because I know, at last, who I am. And I know I was never the joke. I was always the story. A year has a way of passing both slowly and all at once. The seasons turn, leaves fall and grow again, birthdays slip by, and before I knew it, Father's Day had returned. I woke early that morning, sunlight spilling through the curtains of my modest home. Yes, I could have bought a mansion by now, something with marble floors and chandeliers. But I didn't. I stayed in a place that felt like mine, walls that carried my history, a neighborhood where people knew me by name, not by numbers in the bank. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once scratched that ticket, trembling hands revealing numbers that changed my life. A year later, I realized it wasn't the ticket itself that had changed me. It was what I chose to do with it. The phone still rings, though not as often. Some people gave up when they realized I wouldn't hand out checks like candy. Others still circle, hoping for a sliver of the prize. But I've learned to listen differently now, to hear the true heart beneath the words. My daughter visits more. Not always with apologies, not always with the right words, but she comes. Sometimes we just sit together in silence, her hand resting on mine as if we're building a new bridge, one plank at a time. She still has her life, her husband, her in-laws, their shiny cars and vacations. But every so often, she looks at me the way she used to, and in those moments I feel the years roll back. This Father's Day, she brought me something simple, a framed photograph of the two of us from when she was little. I was holding her on my shoulders at the county fair, her cotton candy smile wide, my own face young and proud. The frame was cheap, the picture faded, but when she handed it to me, her eyes were wet. "I thought you'd like this better than anything else," she said softly. And she was right, because I've learned something this past year. The value of a father isn't measured in gifts, whether they come wrapped in gold ribbons or scratched onto a ticket. It's measured in love given freely, in sacrifices made quietly, in memories built one day at a time. The world saw me differently after the lottery. They called me lucky, blessed, even wise when I gave money away. But I don't think luck defines me. What defines me are the nights I worked until dawn so my daughter could sleep soundly. The mornings I walked to work with holes in my shoes so she could have ballet slippers. The hugs I gave when she thought the world was too big and she was too small. That's where my worth has always been. Now, as I sit here on another Father's Day, telling this story not just to myself but to you, whoever you are listening across the distance, I want to leave you with this. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever felt like your love wasn't enough, remember this. Love is never wasted. Even when it isn't recognized, even when it is laughed at or forgotten, it shapes the world quietly, powerfully. And sometimes in the most unexpected ways, life brings that truth back to light. So thank you for listening, for walking this road with me, for sharing in the laughter and the tears. From one father to another, from one human soul to another, I wish you health, peace, and love in your family. Because at the end of it all, that's worth more than $120 million.